The most dangerous sound in a room full of powerful people is silence, because silence is never empty. It is controlled, measured, and enforced. In the grand ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel in Manhattan, silence had a price tag higher than the chandeliers hanging above the marble floor. Every glass reflected soft golden light. Every suit was tailored within an inch of perfection, and every smile was carefully negotiated like a business contract. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire CEO whose presence did not ask for attention but commanded it, as if the air itself had been trained to respond to him. He held a half-filled glass of bourbon and spoke casually, almost playfully, as though the room existed to validate his thoughts. "You know what separates success from talent?" Ethan said with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. A light chuckle followed from a few executives, the kind of laughter that arrives before permission is fully understood. Then it stopped, not because the joke ended, but because the room realized it was being evaluated. 1 second too long, one reaction too honest, and everything could shift. Conversations died mid-breath. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The room learned quickly what it meant to be observed by someone who had never needed approval. Along the outer edge of the ballroom, moving quietly between tables dressed in white linen and crystal glassware, was Alicia Monroe, a waitress with steady hands and an even steadier expression. She carried herself with the kind of calm that does not announce itself, the kind that belongs to people who have learned to survive without being seen. No one paid attention to her, not because she was unimportant, but because the room had already decided who mattered. Alicia placed a tray of champagne flutes on a side table, her eyes briefly lifting toward Ethan without expression, as if registering a pattern she had seen before. Around her, the guests were still frozen in polite uncertainty, waiting for the correct emotional response to be revealed like an answer sheet. Ethan continued speaking, his voice relaxed but precise, describing success as a kind of instinct. Only a few were born with. Another pause followed, heavier this time, as if the room itself was being pressed downward by invisible weight. That was when it happened. A sound broke through the silence. Not applause, not agreement, but laughter. Soft at first, then unmistakably real. Alicia had laughed. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was genuine, and in a room where authenticity had been carefully filtered out, it landed like a disruption no one had prepared for. Heads turned immediately. Forks stopped midair. Someone near the center of the table whispered something under their breath, not quite believing what they had heard. Ethan's gaze shifted slowly toward the source, not hurried, not emotional, but dangerously focused. The kind of focus that does not question what happened, but who allowed it. Alicia did not step back. She did not apologize. She simply met the weight of the room with a calm that did not belong to fear. In that moment, something subtle but irreversible began to shift. The silence was no longer protecting Ethan's control. It was exposing it. And for the first time that evening, the room did not know who it was supposed to obey. A silence that once felt like control now felt like exposure, as every person in the room slowly realized that the laughter had changed the balance of something unspoken, something that could not be measured in money or status. Ethan Caldwell did not react immediately, not because he was calm, but because he was calculating, the way a person does when the environment no longer behaves according to expectation. His eyes remained locked on Alicia Monroe, as if trying to classify her into a category that would restore order to the moment, but there was none available that fit. Around them, executives shifted in their seats, adjusting ties, clearing throats, pretending to find meaning in their glassware, while secretly searching for permission to breathe normally again. A senior investor leaned slightly toward a colleague and whispered something about inappropriate behavior, but even his whisper carried uncertainty, as if he was not sure who had the authority to define inappropriate anymore. Alicia stood where she was, still holding the empty tray at her side, her posture unchanged, as though the room had not just redefined itself around her single moment of laughter. Ethan finally spoke, his voice controlled but sharpened by something quieter underneath. He asked what exactly she found amusing, not as a question seeking understanding, but as a boundary being drawn in real time. The room leaned in without moving, waiting for her response the way people wait for weather to decide whether it will turn dangerous. Alicia looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice was steady, calm, and without urgency. She said she found it interesting how quickly confidence could fill a room when no one felt safe enough to question it. The words did not rise in volume, yet they spread through the space with a kind of precision that made several guests glance away instinctively. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition that the conversation had shifted into territory he could not easily redirect. A hotel manager stepped closer, sensing the disruption and attempting to intervene with polite professionalism, but stopped short when he realized there was no procedural script for what was happening. The ballroom, designed for controlled elegance, now felt like it was holding its breath under unfamiliar conditions. Ethan took a slow step forward, closing a small distance that felt larger than it should have, and reminded Alicia that she was employed to serve the room, not define it. There was no raise in his voice, yet the implication carried weight, the kind of weight that usually ended conversations before they began. Alicia nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting its limitation. She then asked, still in the same calm tone, whether serving a room meant accepting everything it chose to believe about itself without question. The question was simple, almost polite, but it landed with precision among the listeners who were no longer certain of their roles in the exchange. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had been watching the situation unfold without intervening, and that their silence had also been a form of participation. Ethan paused, just long enough for the room to notice that he was no longer steering the pace of the interaction. For the first time, the control he had assumed was natural began to feel conditional, dependent on agreement rather than authority. Alicia gently placed the tray onto a nearby table, signaling not defiance, but completion of a task that no longer felt relevant to what was happening. The sound of the tray touching the surface was soft, yet it marked a transition that everyone in the room instinctively understood, even if none of them could articulate it. And in that shared uncertainty, something subtle but irreversible continued to take shape, as if the room itself had begun to learn a new way of listening. The atmosphere in the ballroom had not settled after the previous exchange. Instead, it had shifted into something more unstable, like a surface tension stretched too far without breaking. Conversations attempted to restart in quiet corners, but none of them regained their earlier ease, as if every sentence now had to pass through the memory of what had just occurred. Ethan Caldwell remained near the center of the room, not moving with urgency, but no longer anchored in the same invisible control that had defined him earlier. His attention stayed on Alicia Monroe, who now stood slightly apart from the serving path, no longer actively blending into the background of staff movement. It was not rebellion in her posture, nor performance, but something simpler and more unsettling: absence of fear. A senior executive attempted to re-engage Ethan in conversation about market projections, but the words failed to land properly, dissolving halfway into distraction as Ethan barely acknowledged them. The room had become a divided space, where one half pretended normalcy while the other half quietly tracked a shift it did not fully understand. Alicia did not speak immediately. She adjusted her grip on the empty tray, then placed it gently on a side table with no urgency, as if concluding a task that no longer defined her role in the room. Ethan finally broke his silence again, his tone lower now, more measured, as if recalibrating his approach. He stated that order in environments like this was necessary, that structure allowed success to exist without chaos. The statement was not directed only at her, but at the room itself, an attempt to reassert a framework that had begun to feel fragile. A few guests nodded automatically, the way people do when they recognize authority trying to reestablish itself. Yet their agreement lacked conviction. Alicia listened fully before responding, and when she did, her voice remained steady and unhurried. She said that structure without understanding often becomes a way to protect comfort rather than truth, and that comfort can sometimes disguise itself as order. The words were simple, yet they carried a clarity that caused several people to stop pretending to check their phones or adjust their seating. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not with anger alone, but with the recognition that his language was no longer framing the situation as effectively as it used to. A woman seated near the front table quietly set her glass down earlier than intended, the sound of glass touching marble seeming louder than it should have been, as if the room itself was becoming more sensitive to small actions. Ethan took a measured step to the side, positioning himself so that he could once again be seen as the focal point of the room, but the effect was weaker than intended. The attention did not fully return to him. It remained divided, pulled between expectation and curiosity. Alicia finally looked directly at him again and asked, without raising her voice, whether success still meant anything if it required everyone else in the room to stop thinking independently in order for it to feel stable. The question did not accuse. It simply exposed a contradiction that many had unconsciously accepted. A silence followed, but it was different from the earlier silence. It was no longer enforced by hierarchy. It was created by reflection. Ethan paused longer this time before responding, and in that pause, something in the room shifted again. A sense of uncertainty spread quietly, not as panic, but as recognition that the rules being followed had never been openly agreed upon. One guest near the back attempted a light laugh to ease the tension, but it faded quickly when no one joined. Ethan's voice returned with controlled firmness as he reminded Alicia that positions within the room existed for a reason, and that questioning them in such a setting was inappropriate. Yet, even as he said it, the words felt less absolute than before, as if they were being spoken from a position that required reinforcement rather than assumed respect. Alicia did not challenge the structure directly. Instead, she asked whether a position loses its meaning the moment it can no longer be questioned without fear of consequence. The question lingered longer than any instruction or statement that had been made that evening. Around them, the guests began to realize that they were no longer merely observing a conversation between a CEO and a waitress, but witnessing a fragile negotiation between control and awareness. And in that realization, the room itself began to feel less like a stage and more like a space where something permanent was quietly being rewritten. A subtle change had begun to spread through the ballroom, not as a visible movement, but as a collective adjustment in perception, as if everyone present had quietly agreed that the rules governing the evening were no longer fully reliable. Conversations that had previously attempted to recover their original rhythm now carried hesitation, each sentence shaped by awareness of how easily meaning could shift. Ethan Caldwell remained standing near the central space of the room, his posture still composed, yet the confidence that once defined his stillness now appeared more deliberate than natural. Alicia Monroe stood a few steps away, no longer moving between tables, no longer performing any visible function tied to service, yet also not attempting to claim attention. The space between them had become the focal point of the room, as though the entire environment had narrowed its attention into that single tension. A senior board member finally stepped forward, attempting to restore procedural order by addressing Alicia directly in a measured tone that emphasized workplace boundaries and professional conduct. His words were careful, structured, and meant to re-establish hierarchy through language that had been used many times before in commerce settings. Yet as he spoke, it became increasingly clear that the authority behind those phrases was being tested not by resistance, but by silence that no longer reacted in predictable ways. Alicia listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if weighing not the authority of the speaker, but the assumptions embedded within his reasoning. When the board member finished, there was a brief pause that no one immediately filled, and in that pause the atmosphere shifted again, subtly acknowledging that restoration attempts were no longer automatically effective. Ethan finally spoke, his tone controlled but carrying a sharper edge than before, stating that structure was not optional in environments of leadership, and that disruption without consequence would lead to instability. Several guests nodded in agreement, but the motion felt delayed, as if their bodies were reacting after their certainty had already been questioned. Alicia turned her attention toward Ethan fully for the first time since the exchange began, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but carried a clarity that did not seek validation from the room. She said that stability built only on silence was not stability at all, but a condition dependent on agreement that had never been consciously chosen. The words were not loud, yet they landed with enough precision that even those who disagreed felt compelled to consider them before responding. Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in the recognition that the situation was no longer about a single moment of laughter, but about the framework that had allowed that moment to matter. A few guests exchanged brief glances, beginning to realize that what unsettled them was not Alicia's presence, but the way she was articulating something they had experienced but never named. The hotel manager attempted once more to intervene, suggesting in a polite but firm manner that the situation could be resolved privately, away from the main floor, yet his suggestion felt less like authority and more like avoidance. Alicia did not move. Instead, she asked a question that redirected the entire room's attention without raising her voice, asking whether environments that the air in the ballroom had grown heavier, not from noise but from the absence of certainty, as if every person inside had begun to realize that what they once accepted as order was now quietly unraveling in real time. Ethan Caldwell stood still for a moment longer than anyone was comfortable with, his expression controlled but no longer effortless, as if he was recalculating not only the situation but also how he had been perceived within it. Alicia Monroe remained where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, her calm presence no longer invisible but fully present in a way that made silence feel like a shared responsibility rather than an imposed rule. Around them, guests began to shift their attention in fragmented ways, some pretending to engage in side conversations while others openly watched, unable to look away from the subtle tension forming between authority and awareness. A senior investor cleared his throat and attempted to redirect the atmosphere by commenting on the importance of maintaining professionalism in high-value negotiations, but his words landed softly, lacking the certainty he intended, as if even he could feel that professionalism had already been redefined by what had just occurred. Ethan finally turned slightly toward the nearest staff member and requested, in a controlled tone, that the situation be managed appropriately, framing it as a disruption rather than a dialogue. But even as he spoke, there was a slight hesitation in his voice that suggested he was no longer entirely sure the room would respond as it once did. The manager stepped forward quickly, visibly tense, attempting to restore hierarchy by addressing Alicia directly and reminding her of her role within the service structure, but the words felt rehearsed, as though they belonged to a system that no longer matched the reality unfolding in front of them. Alicia listened without interruption, her posture steady, and when she finally spoke, she did so without raising her voice or changing her calm rhythm, stating that roles only maintain meaning when they are not used to silence understanding. The statement was simple, but its effect was immediate, causing a subtle ripple of discomfort across the table where guests began to glance at one another rather than at the center of authority. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he stepped forward, attempting to reclaim control by reframing the moment as a misunderstanding that had gone too far, emphasizing structure, respect, and the boundaries of professional conduct. But the more he spoke, the more it felt like he was reinforcing a version of reality that no longer held consensus. Alicia's gaze remained steady on him as she responded quietly that misunderstanding was often what people called it when they were no longer comfortable with being questioned, and the words settled into the room with an uncomfortable clarity that made several guests instinctively lower their eyes. At the edge of the room, a phone was quietly lifted, not with intent to disrupt but to document, as if someone had realized that the significance of the moment was no longer private but becoming something larger than the room itself. Ethan noticed the movement and paused, his attention shifting briefly, and in that pause something subtle changed, as though he recognized that authority in this environment was no longer enforced only by position but also by perception. A faint murmur spread among the guests as they began to realize that the dynamic was no longer a simple exchange between a CEO and a waitress, but a visible fracture in how power was being interpreted in real time. Alicia then asked, with the same calm tone, whether influence should still be considered legitimate if it depended entirely on uninterrupted agreement, and the question lingered in the air without needing reinforcement. Ethan did not respond immediately, and that silence, unlike earlier ones, did not belong to him alone anymore. It belonged to everyone watching. In that shared pause, the room began to shift again, not toward chaos, but toward awareness, as if something long accepted without question was now being seen clearly for the first time, and that realization alone was enough to change the weight of everything that followed. The room no longer felt like it was simply observing a conversation. It felt like it was participating in the slow rewriting of its own assumptions, as if every person inside the ballroom had suddenly become aware that silence itself could no longer be used as protection from responsibility. Ethan Caldwell stood with a stillness that now looked different than before, not composed in control, but composed in calculation, as though every possible outcome he once relied on had begun to split into uncertain branches. Alicia Monroe remained exactly where she had been, not advancing the moment, not chasing it, but allowing it to settle around her like something that had always been waiting to be noticed. The guests were no longer uniformly aligned in their reactions. Some still clung to the familiarity of hierarchy, while others leaned into the discomfort of reconsideration, and that division itself began to change the temperature of the room. A woman seated near the center quietly placed her napkin down and did not pick it back up, her attention fully fixed now on the exchange unfolding in front of her, while a man near the bar slowly lowered his glass, as if realizing that even small gestures now carried meaning. Ethan finally exhaled and spoke again, his voice controlled but less absolute, stating that there were systems in place for a reason, that structure prevented misunderstanding from turning into disorder, and that professionalism required boundaries to remain intact. The words were familiar, almost rehearsed, but as he spoke them, they no longer carried the same weight they once did, because the room had already begun to question whether those boundaries were protecting order or protecting comfort. Alicia listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and when she responded, her tone remained steady, but the precision of her words made them land with quiet force. She said that systems only remain stable when they are willing to be examined, and that boundaries built without understanding eventually become walls that separate people from truth rather than guiding them toward it. A faint shift passed through the guests again, not loud enough to be called a reaction, but noticeable enough to feel like awareness spreading without permission. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in recognition that the framework he had relied on was no longer being accepted at face value. And for the first time that evening, his response paused before it fully formed. The manager stepped forward again, attempting to restore procedural control, insisting that the conversation had moved beyond appropriate limits for a service environment. But even his authority sounded uncertain now, as though he was speaking from memory rather than conviction. Alicia turned her attention briefly toward him and then back to Ethan, asking calmly whether appropriateness should be defined by comfort or by truth, and the question hung in the air longer than any instruction or correction that had been given that night. At the far end of the ballroom, a guest quietly adjusted the angle of their phone again, not hiding it now, but acknowledging that what was happening could not be reduced to a private misunderstanding, because the dynamic in the room had already become visible beyond those walls. Ethan took a step back, not retreating physically, but adjusting his position as if trying to regain perspective, and in doing so he realized that the room was no longer responding to him in a unified way. Some still looked to him for direction out of habit, but others were now looking at Alicia not as disruption, but as the point at which silence had begun to lose its authority. He spoke again, softer this time, attempting to reframe the situation as a matter of misinterpretation, suggesting that intent mattered more than perception. But even as he said it, the logic felt less certain, as if it depended on agreement that was no longer guaranteed. Alicia responded without raising her voice, stating that intent without awareness often becomes justification, and justification without reflection often becomes avoidance. The sentence did not provoke noise. It created stillness, a deeper kind than before, one that did not enforce obedience but invited recognition. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly across the room, and for the first time he seemed to notice not just Alicia, but the people watching him, not as background participants, but as active witnesses forming their own interpretations. The realization did not collapse his composure, but it altered it, introducing something unfamiliar into it, uncertainty that could not be resolved by control alone. And in that quiet expansion of awareness, the ballroom no longer felt like a place where one voice defined reality, but a place where reality itself was being negotiated in real time by everyone present, whether they intended to or not. The silence that followed was no longer the kind that waited for permission to end. It was the kind that had already decided it would not return to what it was before, as if the ballroom itself had crossed an invisible threshold where observation became judgment and judgment became memory. Ethan Caldwell stood in the center of that shifting awareness, no longer fully anchored to the authority he had carried into the room, as every attempt to restore control now felt like it required more explanation than instinct. Alicia Monroe remained calm, her presence steady and unbroken, not advancing toward victory, but standing within clarity, as if nothing she had said or done was new to her, only newly visible to everyone else. Around them, guests no longer behaved as a single audience. They had become individual observers interpreting the same moment through different realizations, some uncomfortable, some reflective, all now aware that silence was no longer neutral. Ethan finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried a different weight, less certainty and more acknowledgement, as he said that he understood the concern being raised, though the phrasing itself revealed that he was now responding to something larger than a single interaction. A few heads turned slightly, not because of volume, but because of tone, as if they could sense that the structure of the moment had changed direction. Alicia did not interrupt him, and that absence of interruption itself became part of the shift, because it removed the expectation that she needed to escalate anything further for her presence to matter. Ethan continued, stating that influence should never come at the cost of diminishing others, and as he said it, there was a brief pause in his cadence, as though he was recognizing the sentence not only as response, but as reflection. The room remained still, but it was no longer frozen. It was attentive in a different way, as if everyone was now listening for alignment rather than authority. A senior executive at the table lowered his gaze, not in disagreement, but in reconsideration, while another guest quietly placed their phone down without recording further, signaling a subtle shift from documentation to understanding. Ethan looked briefly toward Alicia, and for the first time since the exchange began, his expression no longer tried to classify her within a framework of disruption, but instead acknowledged her as part of the reality he was standing inside. He asked, in a quieter tone, whether the conversation they were having could be concluded in a way that preserved respect for everyone present, and the phrasing itself revealed a transition from control to coexistence. Alicia finally responded, not with escalation, but with calm resolution, stating that respect was not something preserved at the end of a conversation, but something demonstrated throughout it, and that it could not be selectively applied once discomfort appeared. The sentence did not create reaction, it created recognition, and in that recognition several guests subtly adjusted their posture, as if aligning themselves with a truth they had been circling but not naming. Ethan exhaled slowly, and the tension in his shoulders eased in a way that did not resemble defeat, but rather acceptance of limitation, the kind that arrives when certainty is no longer sustainable. He nodded once, not toward authority or opposition, but toward understanding, and that small gesture shifted the energy of the room more than any statement before it. Alicia then stepped back slightly, not as retreat, but as completion, returning to a stillness that no longer needed to challenge anything in order to exist. The manager, sensing the absence of escalation, attempted once more to reestablish formality, but even his voice now sounded unnecessary, as if the system he was defending had already been quietly redefined by the exchange that had taken place. Guests began to return to their conversations, but they did so differently, with less performance and more awareness, as if something had been recalibrated in how they listened to each other. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, then turned slightly away from the center, no longer occupying it as a position of dominance, but as a participant within it. Alicia gathered nothing dramatic, only what was necessary, and prepared to move back into the rhythm of service. Yet even that movement now carried a different meaning, because she was no longer unseen in the way she had been at the beginning of the evening. As she stepped away, the room did not return to what it was, because what had occurred could not be undone into silence again. It remained present as awareness, subtle but permanent, shaping how each person would now interpret power, presence, and the quiet space between them. The atmosphere that remained after the exchange was no longer defined by tension or confrontation, but by a lingering awareness that could not be easily dismissed, as if the ballroom had absorbed the moment and refused to return fully to its previous state of illusion. Conversations resumed in fragments, yet none of them carried the same confidence as before, because every voice now seemed aware that it could be interrupted not by authority, but by understanding. Ethan Caldwell stood near the edge of the central space, no longer positioned as the unquestioned center of gravity, but as someone momentarily suspended between identity and reflection. His posture remained composed, yet there was a visible quietness in the way he now observed rather than directed. Alicia Monroe moved through the room with the same calm precision as before, but something had shifted in how she was perceived. She was no longer background movement, but a presence that had already altered the memory of the space itself. Guests watched her pass with subtle acknowledgement, not overt attention, but recognition that something about her could no longer be reduced to invisibility. A woman near the far table leaned slightly toward her companion and spoke in a low voice, not about disruption, but about clarity, as if trying to define what they had just experienced in real time. Ethan finally broke his silence, not to reassert control, but to address the room in a manner that felt less like instruction and more like acknowledgement, stating that the conversation had revealed perspectives that could not be ignored in future interactions. The phrasing lacked its earlier rigidity, replaced by a tone that suggested adaptation rather than enforcement. Several guests responded with small nods, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that something fundamental in the atmosphere had shifted. Alicia paused briefly near a service station, adjusting nothing, only observing, and in that stillness there was no tension left to resolve, only continuity of what had already changed. Ethan looked toward her once more, and this time there was no attempt to define her through structure or position, only a quiet acceptance that her presence had altered more than the exchange itself. It had altered interpretation. He spoke again, softer now, stating that leadership without listening creates distance that eventually becomes misunderstanding, and as he said it, the words no longer felt defensive, but processed, as though they had passed through realization before being spoken. The room responded not with reaction, but with quiet alignment, a collective recalibration that did not need agreement to exist. Alicia gave a slight nod, not in response to him alone, but to the completion of what had unfolded, and then resumed her movement through the room, returning to service not as invisibility, but as continuity. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, then turned away from the center entirely, no longer needing to occupy it. And in doing so he did not lose authority, but stepped outside of its assumption. Around them, the ballroom gradually returned to its function, yet its meaning had changed. Conversations resumed, but with less certainty and more awareness, as if every interaction now carried a subtle awareness of what had been revealed. No announcement marked the change, no formal resolution declared it, yet it persisted in the way people looked at one another, in the way silence was no longer treated as absence, and in the way presence itself had become something that could no longer be ignored or assumed. And as the evening continued forward, it became clear that nothing inside that room had returned to what it was before, because what had occurred had not ended. It had only settled into understanding that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. The ballroom had fully returned to motion, yet nothing within it was truly the same, as if the surface of the evening had resumed its shape, while its internal structure had quietly changed, leaving behind a different kind of order that no longer relied on assumption. Conversations flowed again between tables, glassware clinked softly, and music resumed its gentle presence. But beneath it all there was a shared awareness that what had happened earlier could not be reduced to a passing moment. Ethan Caldwell stood near the edge of the main floor, no longer the fixed center of attention, but still present in a way that felt different from before, as though his presence now invited interpretation rather than obedience. Alicia Monroe moved with steady rhythm between tables, continuing her work without interruption, yet the way people looked at her had shifted permanently. She was no longer unseen, even when not directly observed. A guest at a nearby table followed her movement with quiet reflection, no longer treating her as background service, but as someone whose presence had shaped the atmosphere itself. Ethan finally spoke one last time to a small group near him, his tone calm and measured, acknowledging that the evening had revealed something valuable about perception, communication, and responsibility within shared spaces. His words were not performative now, but reflective, as if he was speaking as someone who had moved through understanding rather than resisting it. A few nodded in response, not out of formality, but recognition that the meaning of the evening had extended beyond its original purpose. Alicia paused briefly at a service station, her hands resting lightly at her side, her expression unchanged, yet the environment around her seemed subtly more aware of her presence than before. Ethan looked across the room toward her once more, and in that glance there was no attempt to define or reclaim control, only a quiet acknowledgement that the structure he once assumed had shifted into something more fluid and shared. He turned away slowly, no longer occupying the central space he had entered with, and in that movement there was no loss, only release from expectation. The guests gradually returned to their conversations, but the tone of the room had altered in a way that could not be undone. There was less performance, more awareness, and a quiet recalibration in how people listened to one another. Alicia completed her final tasks with the same calm precision, yet as she moved, she was no longer invisible to perception, only unclaimed by it. Ethan remained still for a moment near the side of the room, then joined a conversation without directing it, listening more than speaking, and in that choice the balance between authority and understanding felt newly defined. No announcement marked the end of what had occurred, because there was no ending in the traditional sense, only a continuation shaped differently than before. As the evening approached its final moments, the ballroom held a quiet sense of recognition, as if every person within it understood that they had participated in something that had altered more than a conversation. It had altered how presence itself was measured. And when the last exchanges faded into normal rhythm, what remained was not disruption, but awareness, settling into the room like something permanent that would continue to exist long after the guests had left.